You're listening to Puma Podcast.
So there's always this phrase or like thought that I go back to, like it's a quote from one of a community partner that they would say is minsan gustong tumulong pero yung tulong ba na yun nakakatulong. That encapsulates that kind of dynamic, especially with a ang tingin sa atin we should be saved because we are this underdeveloped country from the global south, when in fact we know the solutions to a lot of the issues in our country, but we need to sort of pressure the weight of other allies to just tip the scales a little bit in our favor.
A multi-million dollar United Nations program meant to address the drug war killings in the Philippines concluded its 3-year run. All you need to know is this: the killings are still happening, and most perpetrators, many of them state agents, are still at large. That's why in this episode, I ask rights activists and researchers if it's even worth pinning our hopes on international interventions like this one, and what we can reasonably expect from the Western democracies that fund them. I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka. This is part two of an episode covering the recently concluded UN Joint Program on Human Rights in the Philippines. In part one, we tell you how the program began, what it entailed, what hindered it, and why it ultimately failed. It's worth a listen, but in case you haven't, here's a quick rundown.
So the UN Joint Program on Human Rights is it's the first of its kind, in response to the war on drugs, and it was a UN resolution, carried out in a UN resolution in 2020. Essentially, it just really asks civil society and the government to work together. They call it technical cooperation. So supposedly one of the aims of this program is to ensure accountability and hopefully independent investigation.
That's attorney Colleen Arcaina, incoming executive director of the Ateneo Human Rights Center, one of the civil society groups that participated in the UN program.
The technical cooperation aspect of it, or the final resolution of like having a technical cooperation, is a sort of a middle ground compromise. It's not exactly the ideal result that we wanted.
Essentially, civil society wanted a full blown inquiry into then President Duterte's bloody drug war and lobbied for it at the UN. The Philippine government was able to negotiate it down to technical cooperation instead.
And sitting down and going through the program, participating in the program, is quite a task because it's difficult sometimes to be in one room with, like, for example, you mix civil society and the government talking in one space, and sometimes there could be reservations, or it could be difficult to have that full trust with each other. It gets tiring a bit sometimes, because it's a lot of back and forth. But I think the fact that we try to build like institutional cultures around these kinds of conversations, I think that's the important thing about having the program.
We already actually published an episode where we kind of talked about the ins and outs of the program with Carlos Conde of Human Rights Watch. And, the reason that I wanted to have this follow up conversation in the first place is because I think we both kind of landed definitely on the conclusion that, by many metrics, this program just didn't live up to the original concern that the UN and its members were trying to address, which were the extrajudicial killings committed because of the drug war. And I don't know if you can confirm, but Carlos, for example, told me that even within these technical working group meetings, they were derailed not just by the pandemic in the first year, but also government officials choosing not to attend. So I don't know if that's what happened in your technical working group, but just to hear that is so frustrating. After this 3-year project, which Attorney Colleen you described as, one of the first of its kind, how do you feel now overall about these international efforts to be involved? I mean, I can imagine from the outsider Western allies seeing what was happening during the drug war and feeling some sort of responsibility, whether to look good or whether because they actually care, who can possibly know, but feeling a sort of responsibility to get involved and say, hey, this isn't okay. If you want to keep working with us, you have to do something. This is not acceptable. But then all of it ending up like this, which in my opinion, again, falls short.
I mean, it is frustrating. Even if we did try to steer the conversations into hopefully like conversations with which would like result to something more concrete or tangible. Again, in the first place, since it's a consensus and a watered down version of civil society would have wanted it to be, I think that in itself is already problematic. It makes me ask, where do our resources go? What do we value? How do we keep moving forward and pushing back, especially now that since it's concluding, so the resources would now be are not there anymore.
And the resources were quite significant. The UN has tracked over 190 million pesos, or about $3.3 million, raised for this program by partner countries. The top donors were Norway, Australia, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, who all contributed upwards of $500,000 each.
And so what we're thinking now really is, okay, after all this, what do we do? What do we do? What else can we do? Especially at the end of the day, the ones paying for the cost of this cycle of shortcomings would be the families of those who were slain during the drug war, which is, if you ask me how I feel apart from being frustrated, it's actually hurt. It's hurt and to some extent tired of that kind of system.
When I spoke to Carlos Conde of Human Rights Watch, I asked him a question along these lines.
Is there any recourse for all this effort put into this program hoping to address these widespread and large scale abuses? And, I mean, honestly, the program coming up short in doing that. Like, what happens now? Do we just accept that it didn't do what the UN was initially setting out to do?
This actually adds a pressure, kind of pressure on the international community, particularly those countries that supported the program, because now they have to ask the Philippine government, where did the money go? How did you spend it? How did you? Was it all worth it? This is not some part of a geopolitical game that the foreign governments can play. We're talking about lives here. We're talking about thousands of lives, and this is something that we've always told diplomats we will meet with them. You have to take into account the fact that people died, that people's rights were abused, and the Philippine government has not been effective in addressing in ensuring accountability in all of this. So again, the onus really now is not just on the Philippine government, but also to the international community that are supporting the Philippine government, who in fact have their own human rights program that should be consistent with what the international human rights community demands or from them. For instance, the European Union, it has what is called the GSP Plus. This is a generalized systems of preference, which it kind of adjusts the tariffs that are slapped on Philippine goods being imported to Europe, depending on how respectful it is on human rights and certain other more than 2 dozen international human rights agreements and covenants. That has not kicked in. That program, the GSP Plus, has so far been a failure as far as the drug war is concerned. When the killings were at their height in 2017 and 2018, the GSP Plus did not kick in, because what should have happened was the EU should have pressured the Philippine government or threatened the Philippine government. Okay, stop all these killings. If you don't, we will charge you with a lot. Your export a lot of tariff, a lot of taxes, and that would be disastrous to the economy, to your economy. But nothing of that happened. The best that the EU did was to suspend the free trade agreement negotiations. But even then, that didn't stop the Duterte regime from doing what it wanted to do. And because Duterte had pretty much put the international community, particularly the Europeans, at a disadvantage, calling them names, threatening whatever, they just decided to not do much. So now with Mr. Marcos on board, they seem to be kind of making up for lost time and supporting the program. But at the end of the day, they failed to extend the program.
We go back to my conversation with Attorney Colleen of the Ateneo Human Rights Center after a quick break.
The reason that this has been on my mind, even after talking about it with Carlos Conde of Human Rights Watch, is the fact that there is a political side to this. I think there's a reason that the Philippine government, instead of completely spurning the UN, when at first it was seeking an inquiry into these killings, instead of completely spurning them and just leaving, they negotiated down to this 3-year technical cooperation program. And that's because they need these allies, right? They need this standing. And I think since then, administrations have changed, and President Marcos cares about this standing clearly and demonstrably more than his predecessor. And so I think what's hard for me to swallow is the fact that not only does this program not measure up to what it was initially hoping to address, but at the same time, it also helps the Marcos administration have this semi concrete but nebulous thing to present to the international stage that, like, hey, I'm not just letting these killings run amok, even though they are still happening with no attempt at accountability. But he can say, hey, my country participated for 3 years with this rights program, and that's what I'm doing to address these killings and all these other impunities that are happening under my watch. So that is what's hard for me to reconcile, is the fact that maybe there are some good things that came out of this program, good foundations that have been laid because of this program. But overall, like, how do you weigh that against the fact that it might also be allowing our government to proceed with impunity as usual while not suffering the alienation that is usually the consequence of that impunity if you want to deal with these Western countries who, say that human rights is a top priority of theirs?
That's crossed our minds like maybe a million times, that it's such a delicate line that we always have to check, and even within ourselves and even within civil society, that is this next move going to be something that's out of like good faith, or is it something just which is going to be used as a political card? Definitely, we do agree that everything about this, it's political. And the way we go about it is that in every step of the way, we do not lose sight of, we keep at being like critical about whatever government decision there is moving forward. So for example, even if this UN joint program is closing and it's concluding, so originally we wanted this program to continue, right, and not conclude on its third year. But of course, now the government is proposing some sort of a body, like a human rights coordinating council, which is supposed to carry out UNJP like program or activities. But there's little information on how civil society can actually participate. And so even if it appears that it's, oh, okay, there's still going to be a platform where we could participate in, we have to be critical on what that platform is, or if that is a platform at all. Yeah, so for us, it's really being, like quick on our toes, like every step of the way, not losing sight of what our original intention and original objective of accountability and stopping the impunity culture. So instead of just saying yes to whatever a proposed next step could be, again, we think of our original intention, and like maybe we could offer like a counter, an alternative pathway moving forward. So it's always that balance and like dance between those two things. And again, it's that frustrating exercise. But then we do try to, okay, we cannot stop. I mean, that at the end of the day, we really stop because we lose if we do.
What attitude do you think people like me who are outside of it should have about efforts like this one, where the results aren't necessarily tangible or not tangible just yet? You have like nebulous readouts from government officials that, hey, this program concluded. We don't really have concrete results, but it was good. We spent this money, but is it okay to view these programs with a healthy amount of, or should we view these programs with a healthy amount of skepticism and maybe even a bit of distrust?
If someone outside the program would come into the circle and like, join a meeting, I think I would encourage them to just to manage their expectations. A healthy dose of being a skeptic and being critical, yes, I would encourage that too. That's why for every policy, for every program, or for every step, we would always put like a caution sign. It's not to say that let's ditch it altogether and not believe in it. Just that, let's face it, we're slowly, or like really, really, really slowly rebuilding from the Duterte administration. Really slowly. I'm not saying that we are actually, there are already gains, but since we are in this point in time that we're not sure what the government throws at us is actually what they seem to be, then I would encourage to always bring your critical hat with you and to wear them every time we're in the same space to engage. But still with being, with your critical hat and also your honesty hat, and being honest at what we really need and what we really see as possible solutions to our current situation.
I think we've already mentioned several times that there was actual capital involved, donated by these countries for this program. There was also political capital exerted on their behalf in the UN to get something resembling this program. I think they were hoping for something with a bit more teeth, as we said, and because that's also what civil society was asking for. And what we got was this. And I can only assume that they're doing this in the interest of upholding human rights internationally. And I guess for someone who is actually in this line of work, who engages with programs that sort of resemble this one, is this the best way for these Western allies of ours, these Western champions of human rights, to uphold human rights internationally, programs like this one, pushing for programs and funding programs like this one? Or could they actually be doing more from your perspective? Or do they even have a responsibility to do more?
Yeah, definitely they could do more. They could have done more. Not just this program, like in general, like aid or assistance or political leverage coming from Western or foreign allies. I think there's so much that could have been done, or there's so much that there could be done by focusing or channeling that political pressure, So ako, like, I always look at it at, okay, there's so much resources. Where do we put them? Diba? Kasi that's how you see if our assumption of the Western allies or these foreign allies are valuing human rights and rule of law. That's your metric, eh. Where do you put the millions? Where do you put the money? Where do you invest the negotiations? Where do you put political pressure? So I think, for example, a lot of the solutions could have been scoped by having civil society early on, like they've been onboarded early on in the program, for example. Because some of the civil society organizations in this program were only included like later, or already when the program was already running, for example. And so that if our Western or foreign allies, they know little of the context here in the Philippines, even if they do want to, even out of the goodness of their hearts, they really want to help out and like push for accountability. I think one of the first things that foreign allies could do really is to know the context here and see where the problem points are and where they could exert that intervention, and that which really, if there could be that kind of dynamic, then I think they could see where we can do so much more. Again, we don't like tokenistic solutions to things. We don't like band-aid solutions to things. Some solutions may not be tangible now, but they should be responsive and they should be aligned with what the actual issues that we experience here, in our domestic context. And if that's outrightly like ignored or set aside, then there's no way that aid or assistance could really be helpful.
That was today's episode of Teka Teka. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. If you want to hear more about this program, check out part 1 of this story, where I interview Carlos Conde of Human Rights Watch. We'll leave the link in the show notes. Pidoy Blanco edited this episode, and our editor-in-chief is Carl Javier. Thanks for listening.